Tehran mistakenly believed its strategic nightmare on Kharg Island was over. American air power had pounded the island mercilessly, systematically vaporizing its military infrastructure. But the critical oil terminals and pipelines were intentionally spared. Petrodollars could theoretically keep flowing to artificially prop up the collapsing Iranian regime. But that grace period is rapidly expiring. The United States is deploying a massive, specialized kinetic force specifically designed to seize Kharg Island. Washington is actively prepping the battle space for the largest conventional ground operation against Iran in decades, an operation that will permanently shatter the IRGC. Make sure you are subscribed to Titan Mechanics and hit that bell icon so you never miss a critical military intel update. And let us know where you stand right now in the comments. Drop a 5 if you stand with the US. Press 6 if you back Iran. Or hit 7 if you just want peace. Now, let's look at the intel. To understand the gravity of this deployment, we must analyze the current tactical situation on Kharg Island. The territory is still reeling from a devastating wave of American precision strikes that, according to President Trump, totally obliterated every single military node on the island. Strategically, little has changed on the ground since that initial bombardment, as the oil infrastructure remains functional. But it is not the current status quo that terrifies the Iranian regime. It is the imminent operational future. Because the Pentagon is vectoring the absolute last thing the IRGC wants to see directly toward their coastline, United States Marines, and they are sending an overwhelming force. According to intelligence confirmed by the War Zone, the U.S. is deploying the USS Boxer and its entire Amphibious Ready Group from the West Coast directly into the Middle East theater. Embarked on that task force is the elite 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, a heavily armed combat element of approximately 2,500 U.S. Marines ready to kick down the door in Iran the millisecond they receive the executive order. Accompanying the USS Boxer are two heavily armed amphibious warships, the San Antonio-class USS Portland and the Whidbey Island-class USS Comstock. These vessels project the massive organic air and ground combat elements required to fully support the 11th MEU during a hostile beach landing. This specific deployment alone is a massive geopolitical headline. But the true strategic weight of this movement is that the 11th MEU is not the only combat element Washington has vectored toward the Persian Gulf. In mid-March, intelligence broke that the 31st MEU had been forward deployed to the Middle East from its staging base in Okinawa, Japan. That deployment brought its own armada of amphibious assault ships and an additional contingent of roughly 2,000 highly trained Marines. The 31st MEU is projected to arrive in Iranian territorial waters by late March, with the 11th MEU steaming hard to reinforce them in the subsequent weeks. This combined deployment will mass a terrifying combat element of over 4,000 U.S. Marines, backed by overwhelming organic air power and the specialized amphibious armor required to forcefully seize Kharg Island. This is not a routine rotation. Analysts at the War Zone explicitly note this is an accelerated, heavy deployment of combat manpower explicitly dedicated to supporting Operation Epic Fury. Kharg Island is the glaring, undeniable target for these Marine units, and the Pentagon is dropping massive tactical hints that it is prepping to execute a kinetic operation on an island that serves as the absolute beating heart of Iran's economy. Alongside the inbound MEUs, CENTCOM has aggressively deployed the MQ-4C Triton unmanned aerial vehicle into the sector. The Triton is not a strike drone. It is a high-altitude, long-endurance ISR platform designed to vacuum up electronic intelligence and high-resolution imagery. And that is exactly what it is executing over the Persian Gulf. On March 20, a U.S. Triton was actively tracked, establishing a persistent orbit directly over the primary oil terminal on Kharg Island, confirming that U.S. intelligence is actively mapping every single square inch of that territory. Furthermore, the Pentagon publicly announced the forward deployment of AH-64 Apache attack helicopters and A-10 Thunderbolt IIs directly to the Strait of Hormuz. Both of these heavily armored, close air support platforms are devastatingly effective at neutralizing fast attack craft, Shahed drone swarms, and coastal missile batteries. However, we must analyze the historical doctrine of these specific airframes. In both Iraq and Afghanistan, the Apache and the A-10 were explicitly utilized to prep the battle space for conventional American ground forces. Their mission profile is to shape the battlefield, provide devastating overwatch, and systematically vaporize entrenched, fortified positions immediately prior to a ground assault. And historically, the very first conventional ground troops, the U.S., inserted into Afghanistan were Marines from a Marine Expeditionary Unit. We are witnessing extreme tactical echoes of those past operations with the massing of 2 MEUs in Iranian waters, and every single intelligence indicator points to a massive, impending kinetic operation focused squarely on Kharg Island. While Washington has not officially confirmed an executive order for a ground invasion, the specialized combat elements being staged are impossible to ignore. Before we analyze the 3 specific operational scenarios the Pentagon is evaluating, we must understand why Kharg Island is the ultimate strategic center of gravity. It is a tiny strip of rock, barely 5 miles end to end, and the U.S. has already systematically dismantled its defensive military infrastructure. But Kharg Island's true value is purely economic. It is the absolute epicenter of Iran's petrodollar machine. While Iran sits on roughly 10% of the world's proven oil reserves, it is on Kharg Island where the massive terminal facilities and deep water pipelines are located. This tiny island physically processes and loads the crude and refined petroleum onto the supertankers that supply Iran's remaining client states. According to CBS News, Kharg Island historically handles a staggering 85 to 95% of all Iranian crude oil exports. This is a catastrophic vulnerability for Tehran. The regime's hostile actions in the Strait of Hormuz have intentionally spiked global crude prices, making the continuous operation of Kharg Island absolutely vital to keeping the IRGC funded. Based on 2024 economic data from the Tehran Times, Iranian oil revenue exceeded $46 billion. If Kharg Island processes 95% of that volume, physically losing control of this specific island would instantly rip a $43.7 billion crater into the Iranian economy. At the exact moment the regime is bleeding cash. This massive economic leverage provides the ultimate tactical motivation for the United States to physically occupy Kharg Island. Seizing the oil terminals applies terminal, regime-ending pressure on Tehran to capitulate to the demands of Operation Epic Fury. But the geopolitical chess match goes even deeper. As a second heavily armed MEU steams toward the Gulf, Washington is actively weaponizing Kharg Island as the ultimate bargaining chip to force the IRGC to abandon its asymmetric chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran's final, desperate strategy to force the U.S. to halt Operation Epic Fury relies entirely on its ability to paralyze global shipping through that specific strait. Billions of dollars in global commerce, roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply, and 20% of all liquefied natural gas, must transit that narrow corridor. By utilizing suicide drones and fast attack craft to terrorize merchant vessels, the IRGC intentionally engineers global price shocks. Oil surging past $100 a barrel is not a market fluctuation. It is a direct result of tanker captains refusing to transit the kill zone. The strategic math for the Pentagon is brutally simple. Massing U.S. Marines to execute a Kharg Island takeover grants Washington the ultimate trump card to force Iran to stand down in the Strait of Hormuz. If the IRGC attempts to paralyze the global energy supply, the U.S. will respond by physically seizing the infrastructure that generates billions for the Iranian regime. Furthermore, physically inserting American boots on the ground on Kharg Island sends a terrifying, undeniable message of absolute resolve. According to General Joseph Votel, the former commander of U.S. Central Command, a ground occupation achieves 2 massive strategic goals. I get that it has an informational and kind of messaging advantage against the Iranians that we are on their territory. And it may send a message to the broader energy community that we are safeguarding these vital Iranian infrastructures, Votel detailed to the war zone on March 20. Occupying sovereign Iranian territory proves to the IRGC that Washington is not bluffing. While simultaneously demonstrating to the global energy markets that the U.S. military is actively securing the Strait of Hormuz. The deployment of the 11th MEU to reinforce the 31st MEU aggressively amplifies that kinetic messaging. However, executing an amphibious assault on Kharg Island presents severe tactical challenges, which we will deconstruct right now. The Pentagon essentially has three distinct operational scenarios utilizing these massing marine units. The first, and most aggressive, is a direct amphibious assault to physically occupy the island, which we will analyze shortly. The second, less kinetic option involves utilizing the MEUs to establish a suffocating, impenetrable naval blockade directly around Kharg Island, physically preventing Iran from exporting a single drop of oil. This strategy forces Iran to swallow its own bitter medicine. The U.S. would actively prevent merchant supertankers from loading at the terminal, effectively strangling the regime's economy without the massive geopolitical escalation of a ground invasion. As the war zone notes, this is a highly viable contingency. The U.S. is not just deploying Marines, it is vectoring two complete amphibious ready groups into the theater. That provides CENTCOM with roughly half a dozen specialized amphibious warships perfectly suited to form a steel wall around the Kharg Island terminals, while the U.S. maintains multiple carrier strike groups in the region. Utilizing the massive supercarriers for a close-in blockade exposes them to unacceptable risk from Iranian asymmetric counterattacks. Utilizing the ARGs allows the U.S. to neutralize Kharg Island's economic output while maintaining a defensive posture. Washington could effectively strangle the Iranian economy while claiming it is avoiding a massive escalation of Operation Epic Fury. However, the tactical reality of a blockade is highly complex. To physically intercept and turn back massive supertankers, the inbound ARGs would have to position themselves relatively close to the Iranian coastline, transforming them into high-value, static targets for IRGC suicide drones and anti-ship ballistic missiles. A blockade requires warships to maintain predictable, fixed patrols, affording Iran's surviving coastal missile batteries multiple opportunities to establish a firing solution. This exact threat matrix is likely the primary reason CENTCOM is heavily deploying A-10 Thunderbolt IIs and AH-64 Apaches into the sector. The Warthog, specifically, is the ultimate platform for continuously loitering over the coastline and instantly vaporizing IRGC missile batteries the second they expose themselves. Yet, the severe threat of an Iranian asymmetric counterattack remains the primary hurdle for the most aggressive and highly anticipated U.S. option, putting conventional combat boots on the ground. The raw combat math heavily supports a direct amphibious assault on Kharg Island, and there is massive political appetite in Washington for this exact kinetic action. Senator Lindsey Graham has aggressively pushed this narrative, literally invoking the brutal legacy of Iwo Jima while demanding the U.S. seize Kharg Island by overwhelming force. Here's what I tell President Trump. Keep it up for a few more weeks. Take Kharg Island, where all of the resources they have to produce oil. Control that island. Let this regime die on a vine, Graham stated during an interview on Fox News Sunday. While the exact timeline of the executive order remains highly classified, the tactical pieces are aggressively being locked into place. Beyond the massive deployment of the MEUs, CBS News reported on March 20 that Pentagon planners have already finalized highly detailed, actionable blueprints for inserting conventional U.S. ground forces into Iranian territory. President Trump himself is actively utilizing strategic ambiguity to mask the Pentagon's true intentions. "No, I'm not putting troops anywhere," he stated to the press on March 19, before immediately pivoting. "If I were, I certainly wouldn't tell you." If the green light is given, the sheer mass of Marines currently vectoring toward Kharg Island is overwhelmingly sufficient to violently seize the territory. General Votel estimates that CENTCOM would require a relatively light footprint of 800 to 1,000 elite Marines to systematically clear the island of whatever fractured, degraded IRGC units survived the initial American airstrikes. However, analysis from the Sunday Times disputes that low estimate, suggesting that even the 2,200 Marines of the 31st MEU might face stiff resistance, heavily dependent on the actual attrition rate suffered by the Iranian garrison during the opening bombardment. Securing the initial beachhead is one thing. Establishing a hardened, impenetrable defensive perimeter to permanently hold the island requires massive manpower. This strategic reality perfectly explains why the 11th MEU is currently burning fuel to reach the Middle East. In amphibious warfare, overwhelming mass is survival. It is vastly superior to deploy overwhelming force than to risk a contested landing with insufficient combat power. But these incoming MEUs represent the absolute apex predators of amphibious warfare. They are highly specialized operators, backed by real-time orbital intelligence and overwhelming close air support that has already ruthlessly shaped the battlefield. Integrate the heavy artillery, armored amphibious assault vehicles, attack helicopters, and the stealth F-35B Lightning IIs arriving with the ARGs, and you have a massive kinetic hammer perfectly designed to crush the shattered Iranian defenders on Kharg Island. Violently seizing the island is highly probable. Permanently holding it, however, introduces the exact same tactical vulnerabilities as a naval blockade. The U.S. Marines and their heavy equipment dug in on Kharg Island would instantly become a static, high-value target for the IRGC. Despite the systematic destruction of Iran's strategic missile forces, the regime retains the localized capability to strike stationary targets with short-range ballistic missiles. Kharg Island sits a mere 20 miles off the Iranian mainland, well within the lethal range of surviving coastal batteries, while the closest secure American logistical base is over 120 miles away. Furthermore, the massive logistical train required to supply the occupying Marines would be forced to run a gauntlet of IRGC fast attack craft and suicide drones. CENTCOM possesses the overwhelming air power required to mitigate those naval threats. The forward-deployed A-10S and Apaches would serve as devastating, permanent escorts for the vulnerable supply convoys. Regarding the ballistic missile threat, American air power can easily vaporize identified launch sites, but neutralizing highly mobile, camouflaged batteries before they launch remains a severe tactical challenge. The ultimate strategic deterrence, however, is purely economic. If the IRGC launches a massive missile barrage at U.S. Marines entrenched on Kharg Island, they virtually guarantee the catastrophic destruction of their own vital oil pipelines in the crossfire. Would Tehran risk permanently destroying the exact infrastructure they are fighting to protect? Does that risk even matter if a permanent American occupation permanently strips the regime of its oil revenue regardless? These are the critical strategic calculations being weighed as the MEUs steam toward the Persian Gulf. There is, however, a third, utterly devastating option, a scenario where the MEUs are not even required to shed blood. CENTCOM could simply execute a massive, strategic bombing campaign to permanently vaporize the Kharg Island oil infrastructure into dust, completely avoiding the massive logistical and tactical risks of a blockade or a ground occupation. There would be no static American targets for IRGC missiles to strike. According to economic analysis by CNBC, obliterating the Kharg Island terminal and deep-water pipelines would instantly sever the 1.5 million barrels per day in crude exports that physically keep the Iranian regime alive. Rebuilding that highly specialized, massive infrastructure would require years of uninterrupted construction. A logistical impossibility for a regime that just had its entire economy vaporized by American stealth bombers. It presents a brutal, clean solution. No Marines in the line of fire. However, the geopolitical fallout of that action would be massive. Vaporizing Kharg Island's infrastructure would trigger a catastrophic multi-year supply shock for nations highly dependent on Iranian crude. China is the absolute primary buyer, historically absorbing roughly 80% of Iran's illicit oil shipments. Geopolitical tensions between Washington and Beijing are already severe, and permanently destroying Kharg Island would drastically escalate that friction. Furthermore, an act of total economic destruction would almost certainly trigger the IRGC to launch desperate, scorched earth attacks against the vulnerable energy infrastructure of America's Gulf allies. We must also calculate that Washington likely prefers to physically capture Kharg Island intact, utilizing the occupied oil terminals as the ultimate geopolitical leverage to force the Iranian regime into a humiliating capitulation where the U.S. directly controls the flow of their oil. That massive geopolitical carrot instantly vanishes the second the B-2 stealth bombers drop their payloads and the Kharg infrastructure goes up in flames. Consequently, military analysts assess the Pentagon is seriously evaluating only two viable kinetic options: a suffocating naval blockade or a massive amphibious ground invasion. Both complex operations require the overwhelming combat power currently being projected by the two inbound Marine Expeditionary Units. In fact, neither operation is strategically viable without the heavy mass those MEUs provide. The ultimate variable is whether President Trump will issue the executive order to unleash the 11th and 31st MEUs. The administration's messaging remains highly volatile. On March 20, Trump aggressively rejected the concept of a ceasefire, stating, "You don't do a ceasefire when you're literally obliterating the other side." Yet, mere hours later, the president hinted at a desire to potentially wind down Operation Epic Fury. Launching a massive amphibious invasion of sovereign Iranian territory is the absolute opposite of de-escalation. Further complicating the timeline, reports on March 23 suggested Trump claimed backdoor diplomatic channels were active, discussing a complete and total resolution of hostilities, prompting the U.S. to temporarily pause planned kinetic strikes on Iranian power grids. Tehran aggressively denied those claims, with the Iranian parliament speaker dismissing the reports as psychological warfare designed to manipulate global oil markets. Attempting to predict the administration's exact timeline is nearly impossible, but the raw, undeniable tactical reality remains. Over 4,000 heavily armed U.S. Marines are actively vectoring toward the Iranian coastline, and their crosshairs are locked directly on Kharg Island. Whether CENTCOM executes a blockade, an overwhelming amphibious invasion, or total kinetic destruction, the Iranian regime is staring directly into a multi-billion-dollar economic abyss that will absolutely trigger its final collapse. The United States is actively prepping the battle space to sever the final economic artery, keeping the ARGs alive. As a reminder, all tactical analysis and intelligence provided on Titan Mechanics is strictly for educational and documentary purposes. We analyze geopolitical strategy and military hardware based on publicly available open-source data. We do not glorify conflict or incite real-world action. Stay informed, stay analytical, and we will see you on the next briefing.